I'm Nick Redding. I'm the president and CEO of Preservation Maryland, and thrilled to be joined by all of you today, and thrilled to be talking with our inaugural class of Harrison Goodall Preservation Fellows. Um, the Goodall Fellowship, which is supported by Harrison Goodall, provides a short-term opportunity for individuals to pursue a unique self-directed project under the guidance of a mentor. And in just the first year, we had over 80 applicants who reached out and applied to become fellows with interesting projects. And those were reviewed back in the summer of 2020. And now we're hearing from our inaugural fellows about their research. And each fellow receives up to $5,000 and is paired with a professional project mentor. And they're looking at creating original content and research on dynamic and different topics. And so we're thrilled today to be joined by Sara Stratte, who completed her project just recently and chose Michael Spencer as her mentor. Spencer is the chair of the Department of Historic Preservation at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And Sara is looking at something really fascinating, which is developing protocols for using infrared thermography to for adobe structures to contribute to preservation literature and to also help direct physical upcoming preservation repair work. And so these findings and this really scientific research is going to be shared with preservation professionals, not only throughout the National Park Service, but beyond. And so we're really excited to hear about this work. The fellowships span everything from policy to scientific research to advocacy. And so excited to be hearing from Sara about her work and what she's uncovered.
Great. So with that, let me share my screen, and forgive me, we use a different platform in the Park Service. Start this slideshow. Perfect. Can everyone see that? Oh. I'm gonna hope that's a yes. So hi, thank you all for being here today. My name is Sara Stratte, as Nick mentioned. I just briefly want to thank Harrison Goodall. He's a luminary in the field that I've heard about since I started preservation about 5 years ago. It's so nice to benefit from his generosity, and he's really, identified a great need in our field, and I appreciate being part of this inaugural class. I also want to thank my advisor and kind of a great sounding board through all of this, Michael Spencer, who is an expert in this, especially for on wooden structures, but has really encouraged me to kind of push beyond and look at this new application. And I also want to thank my colleagues at Channel Islands National Park, where I work, and where this case study takes place, for being supportive and for always being a soundboard. So my project kind of started as the response to an upcoming project we have at our park. It focuses on a historic adobe building and repairing the plaster on the exterior of the building. Especially, this is looking particularly at damage that was incurred from a seismic event. But this sort of case study has led me to developing a beginning draft for a field methodology for adobe structures and using infrared thermography to detect certain issues, deterioration conditions that I hope to share more broadly with the field, and to sort of, to get, to add to this kind of corpus of literature. So I just wanted to kind of start with a project outline to kind of clue you into some of what I've done over the course of the year. The project really began with researching the use of infrared thermography in building diagnostics, especially for historic structures. This is a pretty well-established field. It's used on many different kinds of building systems. I completed field research here at Channel Islands National Park in Southern California, where I did conditions assessments, did a seismic damage evaluation with an engineer, and then conducted that kind of testing of infrared thermography on the structure itself. Also during sort of the COVID period, where travel was really limited, especially out to our islands, I conducted some laboratory testing to kind of contribute to the literature about looking for the optimal conditions, temperature, relative humidity, testing methodology for infrared thermography on Adobe. And kind of finally, and what's consumed a lot of this last quarter of the project is thinking about what kind of deliverable would be useful for dissemination, and for whom, for what kind of preservation professional. And so from that, I've kind of developed this list of final products that I hope to share. So first of all is the kind of case study results that, kind of that beginning sort of question of my project is, can we use infrared to detect, or infrared thermography to detect seismic damage on this Adobe structure at Channel Islands? And that kind of information will be shared with the public and with the professional public through different conferences, particularly at the Terra 2022 conference, I think is what they're calling it now. But then to get beyond that and to not just publish this paper that will be sort of very technical and very specific to my site, my building, looking at creating a document or presentation about tips and tricks, recommended field methodology for a site manager or resource manager, or maybe for a student to test in the future at another Adobe site in the United States or abroad. So what I was thinking of was distributing a PDF, especially I think a presentation kind of like this would be a really useful way to, I think, convey that information rather than just a really lengthy paper. As well as that would be accompanied, I think, by a list of tools and a written field methodology like I used at my case study site. So the rest of my presentation is kind of an expedited version of that, that second deliverable, the presentation for a site manager, just because I think it offers some good background on what I'm doing, some of the issues that I ran into in my case study, as well as the lessons that I learned. And you kind of get to a feeling for how this helped with looking at the specific kinds of damage on this Adobe at Channel Islands. So a quick introduction for those that are new, and I think also just a great refresher. What is IRT? So infrared thermography is a method of photography in which sensors in the thermal camera detect the radiation emitted from the surface of an object. And then the camera visually displays that information as a thermal image. Kind of by the laws of physics, all objects emit infrared radiation if they're warmer than 0 degrees Kelvin. So pretty much anything you're going to find in the built environment is going to have a temperature. And the amount of that radiation emitted by the object's surface correlates to the temperature of the object. And so what we're really interested in when we're looking at the thermal images that the camera produces is for the variation in temperatures across the surface, because those variations in temperature between hot and cool can indicate anomalies, pathologies, what have you. Probably the most famous example for thermal images is detecting moisture, late leaks, rising water, what have you. But I think it's important to say that, a cool spot, as moisture normally registers as, a cool spot does not always indicate moisture. And sometimes actually moisture can be warmer than the area surrounding it, depending on the ambient conditions of your testing environment. So I guess that clues you into how infrared is not as straightforward, I think, as you want it to be. It would be lovely to say cool equals this, hot equals this, but it's a little bit more complex and nuanced than that. And for example, thermal images can also show foreign or heterogeneous materials, differences between two types of stone or embedded materials. It can also show voids, and in some cases, the variations in thickness of, say, something like plaster, where there are cavities behind that plaster. So here's an example from my case study site. This is the east elevation of the Smuggler's Adobe at Channel Islands. And on the left in the thermal image, you can see a sort of hot spot or a warmer spot that I've indicated with the white box. And that I found indicates actually an area where there's a blind void. If you're just looking at that elevation, just kind of visually by yourself, there is no indication of damage there. There's no cracking, spalling, what have you. And so it's really the thermal imagery that shows us that there is, a void underneath there. Another example of kind of an interesting thermal image is on the left. You can see that the patching material on the surface actually has a different thermal signature and different thermal properties than the plaster surrounding it. And so under these kind of testing conditions that I used, where I had a heating lamp projecting onto the surface, those patching materials actually stand out. And in this particular instance, it's kind of obvious that they're patching materials, but you can imagine where if you have patching materials that are that blend in better to the surrounding material, that it would be really great to kind of have those, pop out. Here's another example of being able to detect differing materials. So embedded on the face of the Adobe is actually probably several thousand nails. The original builders installed the nails onto the Adobe and then actually used that to help key in the plaster. It's something that I didn't know about and was really shocking to find and really exciting to even see that. So with this particular method of infrared thermography that I was using, within a couple of minutes of testing, I could, where I was heating the surface of the plaster, I could very quickly see that there was something embedded within the plaster. And this is due to the fact that the plaster and the nail heads have different thermal properties. And then I think a final example of being able to detect differing materials is the fact that, so this is the south elevation of the structure. The first story of the structure is actually constructed with stone masonry. And then the second story is constructed with Adobe masonry. And this passive thermographic image was taken early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. And you can really see distinctly that the first story where the stone masonry is actually warmer than the story above it with the Adobe masonry. But I took a similar image at the end of the day, actually when the sun had set. And it turns out that the optimal conditions for, registering that difference with the thermal camera, the optimal conditions are when the sun has just come up and solar radiation has just hit the surface versus, taking this photo at the end of the day where it's received, sunlight all day long, that, that thermal signature is kind of lost. So there are several benefits for IRT in historic preservation. I think it's why it's used so widely, especially with other types of building materials, and why I think it also has a really bright future for use with Adobe. Infrared can be used for a range of areas, and in that it's scalable. You can use it to record an entire facade, or kind of the largest scale you can think of, but then also you can focus it down to smaller objects. The images can be captured from a distance, similar to just using a camera. But this is particularly good for inaccessible areas. It means that You know, particularly for me at a backcountry site, I don't have to have a ladder or scaffolding. I can just walk around and take photos of the building and get a lot of information. This method also does not require surface contact, which is particularly good for, you know, sensitive materials, friable materials, if that were the case. And I would also say that there's low experience necessary. Obviously, this seems kind of high tech in some regards. It involves understanding, you know, the transfer of energy and so forth. But, you know, the graphic user interfaces for the camera and for the different software that are involved are actually quite easy to use. And with a little bit of practice, you can be, I think, surprised at what you can do. So this is just a kind of a picture of really all you need for doing passive thermography. So this is, I think, kind of like the smallest, maybe most whittled down list of tools that you would need, and which is particularly good. Part of this project was also testing how to do this in backcountry situations. The structure that was involved for my case study does have you know, electricity on site, but that system is no longer working at that site. So it was a really great opportunity to think about, oh, well, if I don't have power, how can I power my camera? And so that led me to the potential for using, you know, solar power. So to truly make this kind of a system that can be, you know, put into almost any field situation. And so now I'm kind of moving on to some, I think some general tips and tricks that I learned over the course of this research project and my field studies. I think the most important thing for, you know, choosing, I would say choosing a camera, not necessarily using the camera. You know, there are lots of ways to set up your camera to be super accurate, which are incredibly important for more scientific uses of infrared thermography. But I would actually recommend that what's more important for your camera is that you have a time-lapse function. That was incredibly important for my field research. I found it to be incredibly useful. I realized that it does mean that you have to buy a much more expensive camera. As you can see these examples, FLIR is a really big company that in the thermal imagery industry, and FLIR makes very portable handheld cameras for really low prices, but they have typically lower resolution and don't have the time-lapse function. And so while it's a bigger investment to get those two things, I would say that it's worth it. A field methodology that I found to be most useful for infrared thermography was when you're approaching a building, to first gather broad elevation scale images using passive thermography, this just really pretty easy low intensity method of infrared thermography to kind of gain just like a general picture of what's going on with the building. And then once you have that information, to narrow down to certain areas of interest based on the results from the first step, whether those are thermal anomalies that you want to take a closer look into, or other values such as highly historic or character defining features that you're more concerned about. And in my example, I have this sundial that's on the front of the structure, and it's highly historic. It has a lot of original fabric, and I was interested in what its condition was. Some tricks for image processing. With any high-tech, I would say, tool, it's very easy to go out and collect data and just say, this is it, this is the image, this is my product. It is equally important, not just to practice good field methodology, but it's also really critical to go into, your lab or your office to process the images. And there's really no kind of straightforward list of rules, I would say, but I can give you a couple of examples of things that are helpful in processing images to get, more information out of them. So things like you can use a desktop application to adjust the minimum and maximum temperatures that are represented in an image. You can also try different color scales. I used Fleur tools, and they have, probably like 5 or 6 color ramps that all can help to highlight different things in your image. And you can also use different analyses tools. Thermal images are actually pixels that have different temperature values. And so you can use different analyses tools to highlight, what is the highest temperature, what is the lowest temperature, and it will represent that for you. So here's an example of what I mean by adjusting the minimum and maximum temperature. In the image on the left, you can see that the surface of the plaster is kind of all a uniform orange. And that's because of the automatic maximum and minimum temperature that's being represented. And that's kind of the factory setting of cameras. There's a way to adjust that, but it's easier to do, I think, in a desktop application. But you can see the after, where I've adjusted the minimum and maximum to sort of try to highlight the differences of temperature across the surface of the plaster. You can see that there are, hot spots and cooler spots that sort of pop up. And it's really through kind of adjusting that contrast that you can start to see those differences. So an example of adjusting the color ramp where, on the left in this before image, this is sort of the stock color ramp that's typically, I would say typically used. And in this area that I've highlighted, there's kind of an odd pattern going on, but it's sort of hard to see because there are only 2 colors involved. Whereas on the right, I've changed the color ramp, and by doing that kind of helped to, I think, clarify that area and a bizarre texture thing that's going on in that part of the facade. Another tips and tricks for the field. So it's critical to be aware of your surroundings, as they can influence the surface temperature. Shadows obviously are sort of inevitable, but they will lower the temperature of on the surface of the structure sort of artificially. And it's best to sort of try to minimize those where possible. So my suggestion is to do sort of a time-lapse series in each season at your site or at your resource to determine the best conditions for thermography. Because I think, strategizing the time of day that you take a photo and in which month of the year can do wonders. And so here's my example of, strategizing to minimize those shadows, where I took the photos early in the morning because later in the evening, the tree that's adjacent to the structure will cast a shadow across the surface of the plaster. And so finally, my last tips and tricks, and kind of at the biggest scale of consideration, is to think about your climate and the seasonal temperature and moisture patterns, and to use them to your advantage. Infrared thermography, the field methodology is critical, but so is thinking about, the environment that you're in and what those, the conditions are, because they can greatly impact your imagery. And so my general recommendations are to aim for drier ambient relative humidity conditions. This is critical, especially in looking for moisture damage. So for example, my case study in Southern California does have evidence of, basal damage due to moisture. And the best time of year for me to look to try to capture those would probably be August, when the relative humidity is the lowest. But another example is, I think in places that have cold weather conditions, there are certain types of active thermography, which is a method of thermography that would, where the cold weather would actually help the process. This type of methodology is really not possible in, where I live in Southern California, but would be really useful in, say, Santa Fe, New Mexico, where they have a lot of adobe structures. We can use the diversity of different climates to our advantage in I think, designing methodologies. And I think that this is a really exciting kind of way to build upon this topic in the future. So additionally, some future areas of study that I kind of identified during the course of my research is how to deal with north-facing surfaces. They're difficult to capture, obviously, because of the path of sunlight sometimes. And I would really love to keep working on how to use certain types of active thermography on Adobe. It's going to be challenging, but it would be really fun to experiment with, and especially kind of, as I began to mention, in colder climates. So finally, I kind of also wanted to think about how Adobe could be used in different at different types of sites for different purposes. I think that my case study shows that using infrared, where the types of damage are pretty well known, was pretty successful. I could determine the extents of voids that were resulting from seismic damage at my case study site. It was also really successful in detecting heterogeneous materials, such as the example that I showed with the stone and adobe masonry, as well as finding the nail heads within the plaster matrix. But what I would also be really interested to see in future research, whether that's someone else taking on this project or through a workshop, is the use of infrared thermography as a tool to complement rapid conditions assessments for several resources, or sites with several resources, that is. So say in the Southwest, where there are old adobe forts or Spanish colonial sites. I think it could be a really great sort of next step in a conditions assessment evaluation, especially where the deterioration conditions are more unknown. And with that, I just want to again express my appreciation to Michael Spencer for his consultation and advice, to the people at Channel Islands. And I would just like to open it up for questions. Thank you.
Really fantastic and just super interesting, something I know nothing about. And you explain it in such a way that I actually feel like I understand it now, which is that's a big win. And I'm already thinking about implications on work that we do. And, there's just, when you pointed out like that point about the nails, I'm just making a comment here, but like not knowing that that's how that was constructed. I mean, that was sort of a real interesting moment for me, just to kind of think about the implications of this, not even just for repair and how you approach a repair, but also just trying to figure out how things were put together. So super fascinating. And this is, I think, the real value of the Goodall Fellowship, is that it brings topics to the foreground that perhaps we're not even thinking about. And I know I wasn't thinking about thermal thermography when we launched this, but now I know what that is. So that's exciting. So questions, and I think I can see everybody now, so that'll be good. I don't know if I can see if people put their hands up, but you can just unmute yourself and ask. So Stephanie, there you go.
Well, I want to say that, and again, echo your comment, I feel like I have a much better grasp of thermography now. And I think that in itself is an important contribution. I also know, having provided some funding for monitoring of adobe structures in the Southwest when I was AD, I think this is going to be a very valuable a tool for extending the range of monitoring that we can do, particularly with the changing precip patterns that we're seeing because of climate change. So I think this is another excellent example of the potential power of these fellows. I also, with regret, I'm going to have to excuse myself because I'm visiting my daughter and I'm on babysitting duty in 5 minutes, so she can go back to work. But thank you, a very impressive pair of presentations, and it's been an honor to participate. So if I disappear, that's why.
Understood. Go ahead, Harrison.
Yeah, may I add something? I find it truly exciting of how we can start using some really high-tech kind of the technology and using it on historic buildings of historic fabric, and how many opportunities there really are of different ways of measuring and thinking. And for me, I may not understand completely what's going on with a building as I'm looking at it, but devices like this start giving me clues and cause my head to start thinking, could it be this? Could it be that? What am I really seeing? And how would I deal with it? So one of my interests among many are structures that out of wood and of course log structures also as well, timber structures, as to whether this is applicable to that. And that was not your study, but it's causing me to say, okay, I think I need to do this now, and will lead me into exploring. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to say also how fascinating I found this and how impressed I was with both the accessibility of the technology and the subtleties of interpreting the data and taking the measurements to best effect. So thank you for doing a very comprehensive discussion on that.
Go ahead, Donald.
I just had an MRI recently, and this sounds something like an MRI of a building. But the guy who took the MRI and the guy who's going to work on me are two different people, and there's I'm not sure what kind of pieces of information necessary to give to the masons or whoever will be working on the project. Do you have a piece on that or indicators of that?
Yeah, so I think that it's definitely expanded our awareness of the damage across the structure. Whether, it's also complicated too, because what I can't really highlight or didn't have time to highlight in my presentation is that this building received a fairly extensive rehabilitation in 2012, I want to say. And so in this case, we can look at those areas of damage and voids that I was able to sort of determine with infrared and say, and have more of a discussion of, okay, well, should we break in and should we, break into the surface and repair those areas, versus where I think with a building with more historic fabric, and especially more historic plaster, you would have a lot more of a discussion. In this case, I think it'll be interesting to see whether, to what extent we do repairs in those areas, or whether we want to just, proceed with just kind of monitoring certain portions of the building.
I understand. These are next chapter, maybe.
Exactly. It's not just a year. The projects are always ongoing.
I understand.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was impressive.
Sure thing.
Any other questions or comments before we move to the conclusion here?
Sarah, I know I'm not a member of the committee, but I just wanted to say how impressed I was with your work. And as someone who works in a state with a lot of Adobe buildings, I'm hopeful that I will be seeing you soon out here in Arizona.
Absolutely, and vice versa. Your research is really interesting to me and is, a little over my head in some ways, but I think the feeling is probably mutual.
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah.
And if I can just add, again, Sarah, great presentation. But I think one of the things too that you bring to the discussion, and you mentioned earlier on too, infrared thermography on the East Coast and its application on frame structures and traditional masonry, brick, stone. Yes, but it really hadn't moved west, as far as a preservation community. And the more dissemination and the more research that's put out there, and again, what your work is doing in regards to that really helps promote this, which is becoming more and more of a cost-effective technique and technology. I mean, the first camera I bought at Kentucky was $52,000. And today you can get them on an iPhone. And yeah, it doesn't have the resolution that you want, but it's pretty amazing. And so you can also rent now. So rentals are a cost-effective method for it. So again, congratulations, kind of bringing this stuff up, and also thinking about that toolkit, which I love, that can be presented to site managers. So fantastic.
Thank you very much.
And I say that I am truly impressed by the level of research and pursuits that took place. Chris, to you and to Sara, thank you so much for your involvement and for setting the model for fellows to come. And I'm truly impressed by that aspect of where we're heading. And I hope that you can all contribute and be a part of this process and move ahead with preservation.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to wrap this up. Thank you, Sara, for your presentation, and looking forward to following your research moving forward and making sure that we can disseminate this information far and wide. Thank you.
Thank you very
All
much.
right. So that's where we'll clip that. And I think at this point, let me make sure I didn't miss anything here. Oh, closing remarks. Well, that's probably me. I don't know if I can say anything better than what Harrison just said, which is, this is a great first class, sort of sets the stage, and looking forward to following these folks. And now that they're sort of at the conclusion of this piece of their research and this part of the project, we will be reaching out I'll be reaching out to both of them to get them on PreserveCast, so we can get those episodes out and they can share that information. A good way to kind of disseminate that, and hope that they will, and everyone on this call will share information about the fellowship for the upcoming class. There were some tweaks that we made so that the first result is 2021, not the 2020. We just tweaked the site a little bit, but we have actually, it's a good thing. It's showing up high in Google, so we didn't want to lose that page. But we cleaned that up, and would hope that people will share this far and wide. I've been sharing it, and Preservation Maryland has, but hope it'll be shared through the service and in your networks. And make sure, Chris, that Nick Shippo sees it, and others. So with that, unless anybody has anything else to say, Catherine has a statement.
Very quickly, to the fellows, you'll be hearing from Maria and I, or before you even hear from us, if you want to submit your final product to us, we can distribute to the committee. And yeah, we'll also be in touch about the fellowship funding. So just stay tuned.
Well said. All right. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. And hope to see everyone in person someday soon.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you.